Welcome to the Definitions Check video. The purpose of the video is to show you how to utilize the Microsoft Word's Highlight All feature to speed up the definitions check on a complex legal agreement. As a corporate attorney or a paralegal, at some point in your career, you will be asked to do a definitions check or a defined terms check on a legal agreement. And the first question that will come up is, what is this definitions check? Before we get into it, let's take a step back for some general background information. You will notice that most complex agreements will have defined terms, which attorneys use to define a complex idea into an easily referenceable term, and indicating that it's a special term of consequence by initial capitalizing it or title casing the term. And once a term has been defined, they can use it over and over again throughout the agreement without having to repeat the description of the same complex idea. For example, if a legal agreement is about a sale and purchase of assets, assets might be defined to precisely delineate what is being sold and bought. And of course, in an agreement like that, the concept of such assets will be useful throughout the agreement when discussing matters relating to consideration, conditions precedent, and so on. And defined terms are also used as a convenience tool. If the buyer is defined as the buying entity's full legal name and seller is defined as the seller's full legal name, then an agreement can simply refer to them as buyer and seller throughout the document. If you are using this agreement as precedent for a different transaction, you only need to change the defined terms instead of changing the names throughout the document. Now, some people will argue that it is not as big of a deal because word processing programs now come with find and replace all functions, but you could see how this could have been useful back in the day when everything had to be typed. And this concept is still useful today because it denotes parties' roles or function, which is often the more useful description than the names themselves. So defined terms is a useful concept that lawyers have come up with and is virtually universally used in long contracts. The problem, though, is that as these agreements become more complex, they become more prone to errors, or in casual terms, busts. So what are busts? First, a defined term is defined, but it is never used in a document. Or, there's an initial capitalized term that is used, but it is never defined, so nobody knows what it is. Or sometimes a lowercase term is used when it should have been initial capitalized because a defined term for that same phrase exists. Why do these errors happen? These errors happen because legal agreements are generally constructed from multiple sources or precedents. Say, for a long-time client of the law firm, you need to draft a contract to purchase land for a coal company. In that scenario, a relevant precedent might be a contract the firm has drafted for the same client, a contract to purchase land, a contract containing language dealing with the coal industry and regulation that they have to follow, a recent transaction that contains latest bells and whistles, and a contract that an opposing counsel has done or is familiar with, because using provisions from that contract will presumably reduce negotiation friction. And each of these contracts will contain defined terms, and they might be using the same or different terms. For example, we discussed the term asset being possibly defined, but another contract might use the term property to denote the same thing. So combine that with time pressure or lack of sleep or whatnot, at least some of these errors will frequently get through. So lawyers, in addition to being careful in reviewing the document in general, they will also actively perform error-checking procedures to catch these busts. And the error-checking procedure to catch these types of definition-related errors is called definitions check. So let's dive right in and perform a definitions check on a real contract. Here's a sample contract that is available in EDGAR, which is Securities and Exchange Commission's website containing documents filed by public companies. EDGAR generally has HTML documents only, but you can find Word versions through third-party vendors, or if you go to the company's website, under Investor Relations section, they will often have the Word versions. Word versions are better than HTML or PDF because you can highlight them in different colors in Word. Highlighting is usually the best because it doesn't make any substantive changes to the underlying document, which may confuse people reviewing the check result. So, let's get started. Start with the definitions section of the agreement. A lot of times it's in the front of the document, but sometimes it's in the back too. I'm using Word 2013, but you might have newer or older versions. The process is generally similar for different versions of the Word. Anyway, For the first word, let's copy it and paste it into the Find dialog box. Press the drop-down menu here and go to Advanced Find. And you click here under More to make sure that you are doing Match Case, so that you're doing case-sensitive searches. And you click here, Find In, and select Main Documents to search all of the terms in the document. Then take a look at how many times it had been used. If it is more than one, here it's been used 53 times. Then, this defined term is used in the document, and to mark it as checked, I like to highlight them green. You will come across partially highlighted defined term because a part of the term had been a defined term already. In this case, ABR borrowing already contains the word ABR. You still do the exact same thing, except just note that if you try to highlight something that had been partially highlighted, especially the first word will unhighlight it before it will highlight it again. So just let it unhighlight and do it again. When you search for a term, you will often find that the screen will jump to an instance of that term. This is inconvenient because you have to find your spot again when doing the next term. The best way to isolate that event is to have a split view. Whenever you're doing a search, you want to click on the bottom window so that Word will jump back and forth on the smaller bottom screen and you will not lose your spot on the top when doing the search. You will have words that are used within a defined term. If it is one word, then there's risk that the term is always and only used within another defined term. So look around, explore a bit, and confirm that it is in fact used in its own right. The risk of a term consisting of two or more words having this type of error is relatively small. Here, for example, the word collateral. I saw it being used in the context of collateral agent or collateral agreement. Click on Find Next to look around. Here we go. Under Junior Liens means liens on the collateral, so it is independently used, not just within the context of collateral agent or collateral agreement. There will be times when the entire term is highlighted, even though you haven't checked that term yet. That's because the term is made up of other defined terms. You can tell by this intermittent white space in between. So, of course, you still need to search the term as a whole and make sure that it is used. Here's a case where the drafter of the contract has decided to define a lowercase word. Here, in this case, guarantor and primary obligor, both of which are within a definition. I think the intention in this case is to create a local defined term, to be only used in the definition, and they don't want to raise to the level of a full-fledged defined term. This is beneficial especially if you want to make the definition or a section portable, so that when you copy and paste it in the next deal, you don't have to worry about dragging a whole set of nested definitions together. But I think it becomes a problem when people take this inner definition and give it a full status, like it's been done here, by giving it a proper space in the definitions section. You look at this here. Guarantor shall have the meaning assigned to such term in the definition of guarantee, and if you look that up, and it says guarantee of or by any person, and any person is defined as guarantor. Here, if you are using the term just within this context or the definition, it makes sense because you are talking about guarantee of any person. But putting it outside of this context and definition, someone could make the argument that any person is a guarantor, if used in the lower case. I know it's attenuated, but it does lead to ambiguities in meaning. And my general thinking on this is that you should try to minimize lowercase defined terms because when you're reading them, they don't jump out at you. It sort of is like stealth defining, and it could lead to sneaky or unintended consequences, especially in cases where people elevate that local term. And what I do in the case of lowercase defined terms is, I just search for them. If I don't find it, I would flag it red. If I find it, I leave it alone. I don't go highlight it everywhere because in my view, that's not the intention of lowercase defined terms that's within another term. Of course, if it had been elevated to a global defined term, you have to look throughout the document to make sure it doesn't lead to unintended consequences. Here is a term that is used only once. In that case, you want to explore a bit. Make sure that it's not the plural form that is defined, yet only singular form is used, or vice versa. This sometimes happens because it would be too awkward to define the term in both singular and plural contexts. It just adds too many additional words without adding much value. So although you'll see some shorter agreements define in both ways, longer agreements will not. And you need to take that into consideration. So here, let's try letters of credit commitment. After you've checked for both singular and plural forms, and you're pretty sure that it is in fact never used in the document, you can highlight it red so you flag it for your colleagues. Here's another case where a lowercase term is defined. In this case, it seems like the drafter wanted to hardwire a broader meaning attributable to the word person by including legal entities. This is not an uncommon formulation in legal documents, and I would be generally okay with it. I would just make sure that capitalized form of person is not in there. Oops. Obviously, you need to flag that for your colleagues. This one is rare, but there were a few instances, like this where Regulation T, Regulation U, and Regulation X were defined, like it is here, but the actual document simply said, the company will not violate the provisions of Regulation T, U, or X, just like that. Because the junior associate did not find Regulation U or Regulation X, the person was thinking about deleting them. I think it's actually correct to leave references for each of the regulations because the drafter was using a grammatically correct shorthand. But it's best to leave in the full defined terms, just like that, because you know someone down the line will inevitably delete those references since they couldn't find it. Here's another term that is not used, so let's take a look at Section 2.21b. There is no revolving yield differential. This was probably a last-minute deletion. You can see that term yield differential is defined here. I assume this looked probably similar to the above paragraph, but involving revolving loans rather than term loans, but the last-minute change in the body of the document did not make it to the definitions section. That completes all of the defined terms. Next is to search for lowercase terms that have defined term cousins, if you have been requested to look for them. So what you do is, search for the defined terms within quotation marks as before, but use all lowercase. For terms that are inherently capitalized because they're an acronym, like ABR, you can skip them. You can also skip terms that contain them, like ABR borrowing. Let's try additional mortgage. You copy and paste it, make them lowercased, and do a case-sensitive search in the main document. Okay, there are none, so you move on to the next term. Here you have two instances of administrative agent in the lowercase, so we'll highlight that yellow. It's probably not wrong, but just wanted to flag that. And we'll be doing that for all of the defined terms. Okay, that just about wraps up highlighting all of the lowercase words. Now after going through the entire definitions section, the entire contract should be a very colorful document, with lots of green, hopefully only a few reds, and some yellow highlights. So you start reading the document cover to cover, being on the lookout for initial capitalized words that are not highlighted. In essence, you ferret out the undefined terms by highlighting everything that is defined. There will, of course, be many initial capitalized words that should not be defined, like proper nouns, first word of a sentence, subheadings, and titles within the document, and so on. And once you have identified those initial capitalized words that are not defined, flag them red for others to review. Also, review the yellow highlighted words if you think it should be capitalized. This sometimes comes into play, but in the majority of cases, lowercase was meant to be as such, so it probably is not wrong. And that's why this type of search is typically optional. Some senior folks care about it, some don't care about it as much. As you read the document through, you may see instances where a quoted term is not highlighted or not fully highlighted, like it is here for merger sub. What this means is that this term was never given a proper space in the definitions section and was only defined in the body of the document. So I would make sure that all of the instances of merger sub are highlighted in green. My philosophy with respect to whether a cross-referencing entry should be made to the definitions section is that I think a reasonable amount of effort should be exerted to make it happen. But unfortunately, other, more pressing activities gain priority as the deal nears closing, so things like that often don't make it to the punch list. But it is good practice to have your contract be user-friendly, and it is best practices to have either a separate cross-reference table at the end of the definitions section or cross-referencing entry in the actual definitions section to point to where the defined term can be found. Here's a term, letters of credit. I remember a letter of credit was defined, and this is just a plural form, so let's highlight this green throughout, so we know that's an okay term. Here's an interesting one: company material adverse effect. Within this definition, there are certain terms like law, franchisees, and other terms that have not been defined. But before you start flagging for others, you have to read through. It says at the end, capitalized terms used in this definition shall have the same meaning set forth in the merger agreement. So you would need to check the merger agreement to make sure these terms are defined there. This is probably copied and pasted from the merger agreement, so assuming merger agreement is in good shape, it should work. But the less assumptions you make, the farther you'll generally go as a lawyer. Okay, here's a term: LIFO. It stands for last in, first out, and it's a commonly used term in accounting. But these are the terms you want to highlight for your senior associate so they can make a decision. To be honest, if I were the senior associate in this transaction, I would probably let this one go, because it is common enough of an acronym, but it's not a bad idea to simply write it out in lowercase. Here's an example of a bust. It says such facility termination event, which is not fully highlighted because it's not defined. What the author probably meant to do was to reference this revolving facility termination event, but there's no word revolving here, so this would be considered a bust. This is an example of a paragraph that seems to have been added to the document at the last minute. This is a soft call provision, which sometimes gets added to the deal to make it more attractive to the investors. But you can tell that there are a few busts here. For instance, change of control is not highlighted here. Why is that? I'm willing to bet that the defined term is change in control. Here, change in control is the defined term. So let's highlight that red. Here's another one: term lenders. Why isn't term lender highlighted? Somewhat surprising that hadn't, but term lender is in fact not defined. So let's highlight it in red. And this all-in yield, this is a small typo. The I needs to be small-cased. As you can see here, it's otherwise defined. This is essentially what happens frequently in that transactions get modified in the 11th hour, attorneys copy and paste it from another transaction, and when you're harmonizing defined terms, sometimes people just assume, oh, change of control, of course that's going to be defined. Again, it was change in control. The drafter probably assumed that the defined term lenders existed, but it doesn't. And all-in yield, it's a small change that would get missed, but for a case-sensitive computer search. So the lesson is, without going through these types of proactive error correction procedures, you'll just never catch these types of errors. Here's a gray area item, the term UCC. It's used without being defined, and that's because we defined Uniform Commercial Code and don't actually define UCC. In this case, it would probably be best to use the existing defined term, Uniform Commercial Code, so as such, highlight that red. Here's a term, sale-leaseback transaction, that is not highlighted. Words with dash you need to watch out for because it's frequently overlooked. But I think what happened here is different. There you go, sale and leaseback transaction. So there is an extra and. So I'm going to highlight the incorrect terms red. Here is another term that is not defined. This is because holdings is defined, like it is over here. So I will flag that red. Generally speaking, as we were going through the document, I was on the lookout for yellow highlighted words and confirming that they were used in the right context, and in any gray areas, generally, I like to give the drafters the benefit of the doubt that they meant to use the lowercase term. But here's one example where I think it makes sense to use the uppercase term, or at least alert to the drafters. Here's the term unrestricted cash, and let me check the defined term. Yes, unrestricted cash means cash or cash equivalents of the borrower, or any of its subsidiaries. I think in this case, using the defined terms is what the drafters actually intended to do, so I think it's worthwhile flagging for review. Here's another term that is not fully highlighted: secure hedging agreement. Let's see what happened here. A term that has an ing form of a word inside sometimes gets confused with one without it. Yep, secured hedge agreement is what was meant, instead of secured hedging agreement, so I'm highlighting them red. You'll notice that as you do more of these types of searches, you'll develop these hunches based on what you'll know about the documents you work with in general. Early in your career, it will be sufficient to simply find and flag the non-matching terms, but the natural progression of the task is to find and fix them. So it will help you to think about how and why these things happened, And I say that not just in the context of a definitions check, but in your practice of law as a whole. Just as a practice note, one area where you want to pay particular attention is where all of the words are in all caps. When you do match case searches, that will ignore these areas, so they won't be highlighted. So be on the lookout for defined terms, like loan documents in this case, and make sure that they are defined. Here, assignment and assumption agreement is not defined. Probably what happened is that a similar term was used. Okay. Assignment and acceptance is the name given to the form of assignment to be used in this document. So let's highlight those red. Here we are. We've come to the end. This entire process took more than 3 hours. Highlighting all of the defined terms green took more than an hour. Highlighting all of the terms in yellow took over an hour, and reading through the document and confirming things here and there took over an hour too. Before you say, an hour is a long time, how could it take you more than an hour to just highlight the terms in a single color? But you have to remember that this is a 170-page document, and you have defined terms that go up to page 59. More than 30% of the pages are devoted to defined terms only. You have about 500 defined terms in this document, and to do this in an hour, you would have to devote about 7 seconds per term to highlight throughout the document. So even though an hour is a long time, compared to the work that needs to get done, you're being pretty efficient if you could do this in 3 hours. And because of this time pressure, the yellow highlighting often gets dropped in the request. For the final product, you need to organize 3 sets of information. 1. Define terms that are never used. 2. Initial capitalized words that are never defined. And 3, if requested, lowercased words that should be uppercased. We went through the document and we highlighted them. Highlight in red the terms that we think deserves to be elevated for closer review. You should present this information to the requesting attorney in a way that they like. Some people like a bulleted list. Some people will prefer to review the highlighted document, especially if they've done it this way when they were junior associates. Understanding that people work differently and giving them what they want is part of navigating in this profession. So you might be somewhat surprised that we found a bit more than a dozen busts through this procedure. I've seen worse, but it's worthwhile noting that this is an execution version that parties have signed off on and filed with the SEC. You can see that it takes a lot of effort to find those errors, and this document, according to Word, contains over 100,000 words, and to have errors of 15 or so, maybe that's not too bad. But in reality, it's not the number of errors that matter in practice. It's the magnitude of the error, and you can't tell the magnitude of the error unless you find and assess it. And as you do more of these checks in your career, you will surely find some serious errors that you will help correct. And in so doing, you'll gain trust of your colleagues. So I hope this video was helpful to you. If it was, please feel free to leave any comments. And when you become more senior, perhaps you can refer your juniors to this video so it saves you time in having to explain all this. Take care, and thanks for watching.